Great. So one more time, I'm Jessica Salzwedel, Senior Program Manager at AVAC, and we are very excited to have two fantastic speakers with us. Dr. Deborah Persaud from Johns Hopkins University, where she is the chair of the Pediatrics Department. She's also the PI of the PAVE Collaboratory, and we'll be sharing updates on the P1115 trial. Dr. Gabriele Cromhout is a researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as a pediatrician, and we'll be sharing some updates on sex differences. But in order to get us started today, we wanted to do a quick introduction. We recognize not everybody has experience in the HIV cure field, so want to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to language. So a few definitions that you're going to hear on the webinar today. First is some might say eradication. Now, our researchers may talk about this, but also we may bring it up in the chat. Eradication refers to complete removal of replication competent virus. Replication competent just means the virus that can cause harm or cause damage. Durable control. And this is where HIV remains in the body, but no treatment is needed to keep it below the level of detection. So the body is able to control the virus without the need for antiretroviral therapy. Remission. And this is when a person is perceived to have all replication competent virus eradicated, but the status is still unknown due to limitations in current testing capabilities. And so we think that the virus is gone, but again, are not sure. And I think we'll hear this in both presentations, so a really nice way to frame that. Something else we will hear certainly is analytic treatment interruption. And this is a medically supervised pause in therapy. And this is done under supervision of a researcher with continuous monitoring. And we can get into a bit later what this monitoring entails in our question and answer section. Also, reservoir. This is a term that we'll talk about quite a lot in the presentations, but also in the HIV cure field. And here it's the collection of cells harboring HIV, but that are not dividing. So they have HIV integrated inside the DNA, but they're not producing more virus. And then latency. And this is a natural process of immune cells that they stop dividing, but it's not dead. So it can turn back on with the correct stimulus. And I often think about this as like an immune bank. This is the type of thing that if you ever got sick in a classroom, you develop immunity and you want some of those cells to not be dividing anymore, to go latent, so that when you see that sickness come around again, your immune system wakes up and is ready to fight it with all that it has. So latency is a natural process. So quickly, just to say about the science of latency and the challenge that we face really within the HIV cure space. You have in the blue a naive cell, it's not activated, becomes an activated CD4 cell, and the yellow is a virus. And we can thank actually Dr. Persaud for this really nice depiction. Most of the time when HIV infects that cell, the body recognizes something is wrong and it leads to cell death. But sometimes that activated CD4 cell does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is become latent. And that latent cell survives into a resting CD4 cell, a resting memory cell. And that resting memory cell has HIV integrated inside of it, which when you multiply that over time, again, comes into the latent reservoir. So that collection, that body of cells that have HIV integrated inside. Finally, the latent reservoir activates because of a stimulus. And I think a common thing I hear is that all latent cells are specific to HIV, or the stimulus is HIV, when actually it could be anything. This cell could be something that's specific for tuberculosis or SARS-CoV-2. And so it has become latent, and or the influenza virus. And when it sees it again, it becomes activated by that stimulus, whether it be another disease pathogen or something else, and it begins to activate, and then the virus wakes up and starts to replicate, coming out, and then is able to infect other cells. And in the presence of antiretroviral therapy, that acts as a shield, so there's no new cells to infect. But this is the problem that we face in the HIV cure field is, number one, how to identify this pack of latent cells, and then also how to make sure that when you are going to reactivate those cells, that we're just targeting the ones that harbor HIV. And just very quickly, something else I think this is a key concept, again, especially for today. Latency isn't just a light switch. It's not an on or off button, but it's really a state that a cell can be in. And so a cell might be latent that takes one stimulus to reactivate it. But again, it could be in a deep latency where it takes multiple rounds of a stimulus to wake up. Again, this is exactly what you want your body to do, because um, you don't want to use all of your reserves of your immune cells against influenza the first time your body sees it. You want it to be able to fight against multiple rounds of stimulation. So deep latency is a really good thing when it comes to your body's natural defense. But again, with HIV, a deep latent cell can become active again later on. And so those are some of the basic concepts that we wanted to go over today. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cromhout, who's going to talk about sex differences in the HIV in acquisition. And you are on mute.
Okay, good day, everybody. I'm joining from Durban, South Africa, so it's just after 4 p.m. here. And my name is Gabriele Cromhout, and I'm a medical doctor who works at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I'm the clinical coordinator of the Ucwaningo Lwabantwana cohort. So firstly, thank you to Jessica, AVAC, and Pay for organizing this webinar today. It's great to be able to engage with people from the communities and fellow scientists in terms of this work. And so what I'm going to do today is go through some of the work that I presented on behalf of our team at CROI in Denver a couple of weeks ago. And I'll give a little bit of background first, so set the stage, and then go through some of the work, and then I'll summarize as well at the end. So just to start off, the title of our abstract was Sex-Specific Innate Immune Selection in Vertical HIV Transmission and Combination ART-Free Aviremia in Males. Okay, so I wanted to start off and go through some helpful terms. So CART or ART is combination antiretroviral therapy, which is also known as ARVs, or the treatment that you take for HIV. And post-treatment control is when someone has been on therapy for HIV and it has been stopped, and that person's immune system is able to control the HIV without treatment. Aviremia is when there's an undetectable level of HIV in the blood. And viral replicative capacity, or what we sometimes call viral fitness, is how quickly a specific virus replicates or how fit it is. So that's just setting the scene a little bit in terms of some of the terms I'll use. And then I just wanted to give a very basic background in terms of the immune system. So our immune systems are made up of an innate and an adaptive part. And the innate immune system is the first part of the immune system that reacts when a virus or something unknown enters the body. And part of this is a response which includes what's called type 1 interferon. And you're going to hear me talk about that quite a lot. And this is just a graphic showing interferon within a cell. And as a background in terms of males and females, females tend to have higher immune activation, so higher levels of type 1 interferon than what males do. Just like we know females tend to have more incidence of autoimmune diseases, that's linked to the higher immune activation. And the reasons behind that are multifold, but can generally be divided into genetics, epigenetics, and sex hormones. And there are probably some elements that we probably don't understand at this point as well. Okay, so back to the research that I presented at CROI. As you know, and we are joined by Dr. Persaud today, there have been a number of cases of individual children who have shown post-treatment control in childhood. And one such example is the Mississippi baby. And this prompted the idea that children are potentially in a position to have a higher cure potential than adults do. And this prompted our work and our study initiation. And our study is entitled Ucwaningo Lwabantwana, which in isiZulu is translated to learning from children. It's also referred to as the Baby Cure Project or the Baby Cure Study. And the study was initiated in 2015, and it takes place in KwaZulu-Natal, around the Durban area, in 4 sites. And it prospectively follows mother-child pairs following in utero transmission of HIV. And the idea was to find more children like the Mississippi baby and to hopefully define the mechanisms that contribute to this post-treatment control that we see, to be able to help with further cure potential going forward. So as I presented at IAS in Brisbane in 2023, we identified 5 atypical males who had cart-free aviremia within our cohort. So these 5 males were able to, without ARVs, they were able to have a viral load that was undetectable. And these children were off of their treatment for periods between 3 and 10 months due to various socioeconomic reasons. And we were able to test them during this time and found that their viral loads were in fact suppressed, and only found out retrospectively that these children were in fact off of therapy at these points. So in this talk, and the talk that I gave at CROI itself, I also spoke about the fact that the viruses that were transmitted to these 5 atypical males were very low replication capacity viruses. And that's compared to the other typical males within our cohort. So if you have a look at the graph on the right-hand side, the y-axis shows us the viral replicative capacity, so the fitness of the virus. And here you can see the typical males, and you can see they have a little bit higher than what we're looking at with our atypical males. They are much lower in terms of their viral replicative capacity. And if you look at the cohort as a whole, we were able to show that male fetuses were more susceptible to transmission with type 1 interferon sensitive high fitness viruses. So that can be seen with the clustering of blue dots in the left upper quadrant. And so here, once again, we have viral replicative capacity. And at the bottom, you have type 1 interferon sensitivity and towards type 1 interferon resistance. And then if you look at that compared to females, you can see that most of the females are type 1 interferon. The viruses they acquire are type 1 interferon resistant with a lower viral replicative capacity. So what we then decided to investigate was the possible mechanisms that underlie these sex differences in fetal susceptibility to vertical transmission and combination ART-free remission, and how these have arisen. So this slide shows the differences in type 1 interferon sensitivity, or IC50, of the viruses transmitted to male and to female fetuses. It also shows the viruses that are harbored by the transmitting mothers of males and the transmitting mothers of females. So you can see the mothers of males and males themselves, mothers of females and females themselves. So these data could be explained by one or both of 2 mechanisms. So I'm going to go into these mechanisms now. And so mechanism 1 would show that the sex differences in fetal susceptibility to vertical transmission is the result of innate immune sex differences in the fetuses. So males are then principally susceptible to type 1 interferon sensitive high fitness virus, whereas females are principally sensitive to type 1 interferon resistant low fitness viruses. If, however, we look at mechanism 2 suggests that mothers with male fetuses harbor more type 1 interferon sensitive viruses, and mothers of female fetuses harbor more type 1 interferon resistant viruses. So in order to test these two hypotheses, we first sought to clarify what difference in outcome would result from the two distinct mechanisms. The study we have done focused on the transmitting mother-child pairs, and if we look only at these, we'll see that there's no difference between the distribution of the type 1 interferon IC50s between transmitting mothers of males and transmitting mothers of females, which we have already shown harbor mainly type 1 interferon sensitive and mainly type 1 interferon resistant viruses, respectively. However, in mechanism 1, if we look at the non-transmitting mothers, they will tend to be the opposite of the transmitting mothers. In other words, the viruses harbored by non-transmitting mothers of males will be more type 1 interferon resistant, and those harbored by non-transmitting mothers of females will be more type 1 interferon sensitive than those transmitted by mothers of males and mothers of females, respectively. Overall, if we look collectively at all transmitting and non-transmitting mothers of males and mothers of females, and the viruses that are harbored by these, there will be no difference between the two. By contrast, by mechanism 2, the transmitting mothers of males and the transmitting mothers of females will differ from each other in exactly the same way as the non-transmitting mothers of males and non-transmitting mothers of females. And likewise, all the mothers of males and mothers of females will differ in exactly the same way. So while this sounds very complicated, we tried to find 3 ways to test these two hypotheses to try and figure out the main mechanism behind the ability of these children to control HIV. First, we considered data from mothers who have sex discordant twins. Now, sex discordant twins are when a mom has twins where one is a male and one is a female. So in this scenario, the mother of the male and the mother of the female is one and the same mother. And we previously showed in cord blood studies that levels of immune activation are higher in the female fetus, and that these levels of immune activation correlate with in vitro susceptibility to HIV. We also observed that in sex discordant twins, where transmission arises in only one twin, transmission to the female twin is 12 times more frequent than to the male twin. And in 3 such cases, we analyzed the virus that was transmitted to the female twin, but not to the male. And we were able to show that the virus to which males are exposed, but are not susceptible, are much more type 1 interferon resistant than the viruses to which males are exposed and are susceptible, as can be seen in this graph. So these findings are consistent with mechanism 1 and not mechanism 2. In our second approach, we analyzed viruses that were not transmitted by mothers who had seroconverted in pregnancy. So during seroconversion, there's a risk of transmission of approximately 20 to 25% overall, or 30% if the fetus is female, and 15% if the fetus is male. If you simulate these data to look at the distribution of the type 1 interferon sensitivity of mothers of males and mothers of females, this is what you get. Essentially, the two distribution curves for interferon, type 1 interferon IC50 or type 1 interferon sensitivity for the viruses harbored by the mothers of males versus the mothers of females are superimposable. So this is also consistent with mechanism 1 rather than mechanism 2. And in our third test, in our third approach to test these hypotheses, we finally went back to look at a cohort we had enrolled in the pre-combination ART era in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And we had a complete CD4 count dataset for the entire cohort of 674 mothers, including all the transmitters and all the non-transmitters. What we see is quite interesting. There's a significant difference in absolute CD4 count between transmitting mothers of males and transmitting mothers of females, as you can see here on the right. Essentially, because it is harder for male fetuses to acquire HIV, transmitting mothers of males tend to have lower CD4 counts and higher plasma viral loads than transmitting mothers of females. So the point is, the absolute CD4 counts of all the mothers together were identical. And if we consider the mechanisms, this result is compatible only with mechanism 1. So I realize that that is very content heavy. However, I feel like this is a really great slide to summarize what our research found and what it is all about. So while it is possible and likely that fetal-maternal immune crosstalk may make some contributions to what we're seeing, the data presented at CROI strongly favors early life innate immune selection pressure mediated by the fetus as the key mechanism. So as you can see, the viruses transmitted to female fetuses tend to be low fitness type 1 interferon resistant viruses. Those transmitted to males tend to be high fitness type 1 interferon sensitive virus. And those transmitted to our atypical males are type 1 interferon sensitive and much lower fitness viruses than typical males within our cohort. So I hope that that summarizes everything that we were looking at quite nicely. And I'd just like to thank everyone that was involved in this work, and particularly our study participants and their families. And I will welcome questions in the Q&A session. And yeah, thank you.
That was fantastic. One quick clarification question before we move on to Dr. Persaud is, were the mothers taking ART in this cohort?
So, sorry, I just wanted to stop screen sharing there. So yes, 92% of our moms were taking combination ART, and the children actually received this ART transplacentally in 92%. There are, within the other 8%, there are moms who were either poorly adherent to therapy or were actually only diagnosed at delivery.
Great, thank you so much. And like we said, we'll take a lot more of the questions during the Q&A, so please do keep them coming. But I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Persaud now to talk about P1115. So we can see your slides, but you're still on mute. So you're on mute, Dr. Persaud.
Great. How about now?
Yep, there you go.
All right, great. And you can, I'm in slide mode, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, Jessica, for organizing this session, and Dr. Cromhout for such a terrific overview. So I'm going to report on the outcomes of Impact P1115, which is a clinical trial that has been in the field since 2015 on the heels of our report of Mississippi Baby in 2013. And I'm presenting on behalf of a very, very large team and communities and clinical care providers. So I'm going to start with acknowledging that this clinical trial was conducted in 30 clinical research sites in 11 different countries. So a multi-country trial that involves multiple HIV subtypes, and where the burden of HIV infection lies in children. And obviously, as we present the data, because these are really pivotal data for moving the field forward for very early treatment of newborns, I really want to acknowledge our communities, the study participants, without whom this would not be possible. and our clinical trials team, led by the protocol chairs for version 1 of P1115, Yvonne Bryce and Ellen Chadwick, and our clinical trials specialist, Ann Coletti. So I'm going to start with a summary about this study. And so the key question was, can very early treatment of a newborn allow a child to go off antiretroviral treatment for at least 48 weeks and not have the virus rebound, which we called remission? And essentially what we found in this first version of the protocol, in which we enrolled 54 newborn infants who were born with HIV, 6 of them became eligible to undergo analytic treatment interruption or stopping their antiretroviral treatment and being followed to see whether and when HIV would bounce back. And we did identify 4 of those 6 children did indeed achieve remission. And what should our community be hopeful about with this study? I mean, this study really shows that testing of newborns and treating them very early can give rise to remission in few children, but hopefully we'll be able to expand this with better regimens to include more children, which is really a major advance for the field of remission and cure in children. And so by way of background, as Jessica started, one major reservoir for HIV is the reservoir for HIV resting memory CD4 T cells. These reservoir cells are generated during your immune response to a routine pathogen or infection. And within this reservoir, HIV persists in a quiet state that allows the virus to live and survive for your lifetime, including in children. The virus stays quiet, and so it's hidden from the immune system and from the current antiretroviral drugs that we use to treat HIV infection. We know when antiretroviral treatment is stopped, the virus wakes up and comes out of the reservoir, causing the level to become detectable in the blood, the viral load. And this usually takes about 2 to 6 weeks, which is why a child in P1115 who met all of the criteria, and I'll go through that, for going off treatment and being followed very closely, going for 48 weeks compared to this 2 to 6 weeks return that we see is really a substantial difference that we need to understand. This reservoir, therefore, prevents ART-free remission and cure because it fuels the virus to come back within 2 to 6 weeks. And so, as was mentioned earlier, in 2013, we actually reported on a toddler. She was 23 months old, so 2 years of age, who we knew was born with HIV and presented for care at 23 months of age after stopping her antiretroviral treatment for 5 months. And off ART, when she was retested, there was no evidence of HIV in her bloodstream, and no HIV antibodies were found. Really raising the question, is she really still infected? And so we followed that child very closely with viral load monitoring monthly and antibody testing and reservoir measurements. And the child was off treatment for 27 months before the HIV returned. HIV returned unannounced with no evidence of any infection that we could identify that led the virus to bounce back. And we now call this period of going off treatment with no virus detectable in blood ART-free remission. What we identified in the Mississippi baby that probably may have resulted in this outcome was that she received 3 drugs, zidovudine, lamivudine, and nevirapine, at 30 hours of age, so within 2 days of life. And so the question we had was it that starting ART right after birth, did it prevent development of the reservoir sufficiently so that daily treatment was really not needed to control the virus for this 27-month period? So Impact P1115, as I said, was opened in 2015 and was designed to really investigate whether starting antiretroviral treatment very early in newborns at risk for HIV would keep these reservoirs sufficiently small, and we could at least see if we could replicate the Mississippi baby by an N of 1 or 1 case of remission. And I'm going to simplify the study criteria. It's a very complicated study that was implemented by our clinical trials care team on the ground. But essentially, in general, 460 mother-infant pairs were enrolled in this trial, and we ended up with 54 babies who were born with HIV, meaning they were infected in utero. And these infants, these newborns were started on antiretroviral treatment within 40 hours of birth. We followed these children very closely, and I'll go through these criteria, and 6 of them met our criteria to stop their antiretroviral treatment and followed closely to see whether the virus would bounce back. I want to emphasize here, this treatment interruption is part of a clinical trial and should only be done as part of a clinical trial where there's very close follow-up. And unfortunately, we need to stop treatment to see if someone is actually in remission or not. And so the eligibility criteria to stop antiretroviral treatment in IMPACT P1115 included getting to a viral load of less than 200 copies by 6 months of the treatment, to have no virus detected from week 48 onwards, absolutely no detectable virus, so meaning really being very well suppressed. The child had to have stopped breastfeeding for at least 6 weeks before the interruption evaluation period. And obviously the parent or legal guardian had to be willing to sign informed consent. And then we had some laboratory testing that the child need to have had before we would stop treatment. This included having a normal CD4 count for age, having a negative HIV antibody, because that's a good marker of a very low reservoir size, low infectious virus being present, and then having no HIV DNA in the circulation before stopping the antiretroviral treatment. And as I said, the remission for this trial was defined as having no viral load detectable for at least 48 weeks while not taking antiretroviral treatment. And so I want to emphasize that, these are very promising data, but only 6 of the 54 children actually met the criteria, as I described earlier, to interrupt their treatment. It's important to emphasize it's hard for infants and children to take medications daily. The medications taste terrible for children. Adherence is an issue. And it's very hard for families to adhere on a daily basis. And so we need to do better as a field to get better regimens for children, longer acting regimens, to really make this a broader and more scalable approach to remission for children. This is a complicated slide, but I want to walk you through it because each color symbol and each point represents how frequently these children were monitored during the interruption period, with following their medical exam and their clinical histories, looking for virus return in their blood. And for this, we used what's called an on-demand assay, where the child would have the bloods drawn and a viral load test turnaround of 90 minutes, and then frequent monitoring of their CD4 cell count. And remission would, as I said, be some child who went through all of this follow-up and stayed well for up to 48 weeks or more. And so from this slide summarizes the 6 children who made it through version 1 of P1115. As you see, all were from sub-Saharan Africa, 4 are from Uganda, 1 from Tanzania, and 1 from Zimbabwe. So different HIV subtypes, subtype C, A1D, and recombinant A1D. Unlike the previous study, we had 4 females and 2 males in the study who met criteria. And as you can see, these children were indeed infected based on nucleic acid testing. As most of you know, we cannot use antibody tests to detect infection in infants and newborns. It requires looking for the genetic material of the virus. And so all of these children or infants had nucleic acid present in their bloodstream, as you can see, in the first 20 hours of life. Generally in newborns, if you can detect the nucleic acid in the first 48 hours of life, that infant is considered to have been infected before birth or in utero. They started under a triple ARV regimen within 1 to 2 days of age. And for this study, originally we had planned to begin the evaluation for analytic treatment interruption at around 2 years of age. But because of COVID, this was delayed. And so the median age of when the child stopped treatment was about 5.5 years of age. And so the study design of 2 years of ART interruption, we wouldn't be able to evaluate in this current version of the protocol because the children were older when we were able to stop treatment. And I just wanted this, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but this is what we presented at CROI, and I kind of want you to see what we presented at CROI. Each of the bars represent an individual child, going from the one who went the longest off treatment to the shortest off treatment by the hatched bar at E and F. And so you can see all 6 of these children had HIV RNA present in their bloodstream between 0 days and 9 days of age. So confirming HIV infection, not just with their diagnostic test, but also additional testing. They became undetectable in their plasma viral load with treatment very early, but it really ranged from about 3 weeks to about 17 weeks or 4 months. So varied in their time to getting to undetectable viral load. Similarly, 4 of the 6 infants also had HIV DNA, which is a marker of cell-associated infection, whereas the RNA is telling you of the replicating virus. And so they all had also, 4 had DNA detected in their bloodstream for up to 9 days post-treatment. And it took different times for these 6 children to get to undetectable or not detected DNA, ranging from as early as less than a week of age to as late as close to a year of age. And so what I show you on this slide, you can see the hatched line is the follow-up period of 4 children making it through beyond that 48-week period, so reaching our clinical trial benchmark for remission, so participant A, B, C, and D. And you can see the duration that they stayed off treatment. So 3 remain in follow-up to date, participants B, C, and D, and you can see the duration they've been off treatment. Participant A rebounded after 80 weeks of being off antiretroviral treatment, and it's unclear what triggered that rebound. Here we show you the height of the viral load rebound. So the rebound was detected in participants E and F during routine follow-up because we tested them very frequently in the first 8 weeks, and participant A went for 80 weeks before viral rebound. The height of the viral rebound tells us that these kids still harbored very infectious virus with high replication capacity, as described by Gabriele earlier. So 2 of the 6 didn't achieve remission because they rebounded between 3 and 8 weeks. And 1, it was as long as 80 weeks. I do want to caution what we were surprised by was 2 of the 3 children who rebounded actually developed acute retroviral syndrome. And this is a syndrome, it's sort of like having infectious mono or EBV or flu-like symptoms. It's often seen in adults with acute seroconversion, very rarely seen in children, but the 2 of the 3 did develop acute retroviral syndrome. The symptoms were mild and they improved after starting ART, but were quite prolonged. 1 child had no symptoms. So what we learned from this analytic treatment interruption in P1115 is that we need to figure out how to better monitor for acute retroviral syndrome in children who stop antiretroviral treatment. So on a positive note, I think this study, it actually took 10 years. It really provided the proof of concept that very early ART, and I want to say the antiretroviral treatment regimen used here is really old regimens. It's regimens that we have for children that we need to do better with. You know, it was zidovudine or bacavir, 3-TC, nevirapine, and Kaletra was added, lopinavir, ritonavir, when they were age appropriate. So that was added around 2 weeks of age. And we stopped the nevirapine after the kids had achieved suppression for 2 time points. But we could show that in this proof of concept way that we actually can achieve remission in children. And so we're hoping with the newer versions of P1115 that includes integrase inhibitors and broadly neutralizing antibodies that we will learn more about how more children can achieve remission. So with that, I'm going to close and really thank our study team and community partners and families for helping us advance the field of HIV remission and cure therapeutics for children. Obviously, the Impact Network and its infrastructure and the support from the NIH and our clinical trials team. And with that, I'll stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Persaud. There's a number of fantastic questions that have come in. Before we transition to the question and answer, I do want to hear from one of our PAVE Community Advisory Board members, Yusuf Hassan Wada, to just share some perspectives and reflections on these two presentations. So Yusuf?
Yeah, I think just trying to start my video, but I learned the host has stopped it. So maybe I can go ahead without a video.
I will fix that while you go ahead.
Okay, I think the first thing I would like to say is actually thank Persaud, Deborah, and also Gabriele. They have been doing really amazing work. Very exciting for our communities. So looking around the proof of concept, how they are actually doing a lot for our community, and also how acknowledging also the community advisory board, the community for really the push they have actually been doing. So it's actually something we thank the team for acknowledging us and also the diverse team in all they do. Just trying to also flag some two things. I think these scientific studies have really prospect, especially looking around the contribution of sex-based differences to HIV immunology, pathogenesis, and also in the cure approaches. And also, just like Dr. Deborah has said, testing is very important, which is actually part of even the 95 strategy. So as much as we test, as much as we do things related, and also the science that maybe Gabriele has said related to the sex difference, which is really peculiar to this collaboratory, will really be very close to the HIV cure. Also, just trying to flag around how diverse this study was. Basically, Africa or sub-Saharan Africa contributing to majority of this HIV prevalence. I was seeing that this study is typically coming to the Africa to actually shape or change the narratives. It's really very important, and we don't take it for granted. And thank you so much for really putting us at the forefront and for pushing that the places that really contribute are really part of this science or this activities. And the last thing I could say is actually reflecting on the science from the community perspective are really showing that the communities are really at the forefront in everything. I think this study has really bring, right from protocols review, right from even co-creation of other social behavioral researches, and part of even coming to co-create the scientific advisory board meeting, which we normally have representation. And also even at the CrossCap, we are really represented to actually show that this community have really power in shaping the science. And it's really something many collaborators can learn from PIF. Basically part of the pediatric is only related to pediatric population, but they are really doing a lot to actually show a proof of concept that we can really start from the lower level, really what you do for us and for the community for whom we exist, and also for really putting community at the forefront to actually have a good strategy. Thank you, and I will be looking forward for questions or related to the community. So thank you so much. I will really appreciate.
That was wonderful. And I think something you really highlighted, which is really important, is that, you know, a lot of HIV cure research is centered in the global north, but both of these fantastic studies are centered in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it both shows the reflection of communities leading and where the epidemic actually is, but just really exciting to see the diversity of science. Maybe we'll kick it off with some questions. And I think the first one I'm going to go with Dr. Cromhout. There was a question that came in about what makes HIV virus sensitive or not sensitive to interferon. And I think maybe as part of this, you can also explain, you know, I guess recap what virus sensitivity actually is, and are there any factors that determine sensitivity?
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for the question. And the best answer that I can give at this point is we're not 100% sure. Just like in life, people come in different shapes and sizes. So viruses and HIV itself also comes in different shapes and sizes. And we are learning as to why that is. And part of our work is trying to figure out, you know, how we can target certain things within certain individuals so that we can get closer to cure and closer to prevention and an AIDS-free world, an HIV-free world. So to answer the question, no, we don't know exactly why, but it's definitely something that is being worked on by our group and many others, and it's very exciting in terms of the way forward for this HIV remission and cure work.
Great. And maybe you could also talk a little bit about the viral host relationship and what, if any, importance that plays in HIV cure research.
I think so. What I'm going to go back to is kind of looking at exactly what we showed, in the sense of females tend to be more susceptible to these type 1 interferon resistant, lower viral replicative capacity viruses, right? And males generally to type 1 interferon sensitive, high viral replicative capacity viruses. But these 5 males that were atypical within our cohort had type 1 interferon sensitivity, as well as low viral replicative capacity, and they were able to then control the virus. And the idea is that we want to be able to replicate that in more children and potentially adults in future. And if this mechanism is how we're able to do it, then we would want to change these viruses that these children have acquired to type 1 interferon sensitive, low viral replicative capacity viruses. Now you might ask me, okay, well, how do we do that? Well, it's a work in progress, right? So females, if they type 1 interferon resistant viruses, right, they already have the low viral replicative capacity, but now they type 1 interferon resistant. So ideally, we'd want to flick a switch and be able to turn them to type 1 interferon sensitive viruses. At this point, we don't know how to do that. Potentially gene editing, CRISPR, those kinds of things, potentially other immunotherapies. But that's also something that there are a lot of teams that are working on. Then, in terms of our males, the typical males, we would want to, they type 1 interferon sensitive viruses that they have, but they have this high viral replicative capacity. So how do we bring that down, right? How do we make them slower and less fit in that sense? So one of the ways that we hypothesize this could be done is through a T-cell vaccine, which could lead to escape variants, and then you could slow down that viral replicative capacity while hopefully maintaining the type 1 interferon sensitivity. Another thing to look at is BNAbs. But as we said, this just opens up a whole world of options in terms of cure going forward. And that's what's so exciting. The more we know, the more questions we have and the more work there is to be done. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, I think that that's really helpful. And I think maybe some key points to take away is, number one, that I think when you have more information, you can tailor an approach that matches that, whether it be a sex-based approach, but also looking at different factors at the individual level, potentially of a child eventually. But also, I think that key piece about interferon, just to, interferon, like you said, is something that the immune system, it's a natural defense system of the immune system. So the fact that female fetuses are acquiring interferon resistant means that a natural immune defense, that virus has mutated around it. So you also want to maybe flip a switch to get it so that the immune system can target it effectively right away. That's really great. And I think understanding those differences is really important. I'm going to go to Dr. Persaud. There was a number of questions that came in. Maybe just the first is, how easy is it to get children living with HIV to have therapy within 48 hours, or to even identify them within 48 hours? And just the second part of that, of the 54 children, was breastfeeding stopped immediately? Was that part of the protocol?
Yeah, so the first question about how easy is it to get children on treatment early. So our study differed a bit from Gabrielle's because obviously we started infants whose moms actually didn't know they were infected with HIV, or in the other cohort, they weren't suppressed on their regimen, which placed those infants at higher risk for HIV. And so in that setting, you could, which is sort of what was done in the Mississippi baby, her mom did not receive ARVs. And so you could start an empiric 3-drug regimen, the zidovudine, lamivudine, and nevirapine, empirically until you get the results of testing. Obviously, in most countries around the world, which I think is what this study is going to really help with, the point of care tests are not available in delivery care settings. And they should, that should be our goal, to try to make these tests available so that we know we can identify babies who are infected, who acquired the infection during the pregnancy, so in utero, so that we can treat them very early. Because even if we don't get to remission, we know that treatment and early treatment is life-saving for children, and it enhances retention and care. So currently our testing algorithm, which you all know very well, starts at about 6 weeks of age, which could be late for a lot of children who are either infected in utero or in the first 6 weeks through, the delivery process or breastfeeding, which is very common. So to get to your question about breastfeeding, Jessica, most of the children actually breastfed beyond a year of age. And, so we said 6 weeks after stopping breastfeeding, because that, breastfeeding is life-saving to children in sub-Saharan Africa. So we would not sacrifice that at the cost, of a study. It's when the family's ready to stop, and then we would proceed with ATI. But that's a really great question. I think we need to now figure out how to implement very early testing of newborns, as Yusuf said, to get to 95% of knowing who's infected.
Yeah, and I think that there was a really nice piece done by Catherine Connors of EggPath that just came out yesterday, really linking your work and P1115 with just the sort of expansion of test and treat. And I want to go into actually a question about ATIs, and just that I think both researchers have demonstrated that ATIs can be safely done in children, especially if they're under when they're under strict monitoring. So I would love to hear actually from all 3 panelists that since there is a lot of advocates on the line, can you talk about the experience of running a trial with an ATI? What are some of the logistical challenges and opportunities? What is the process for informed consent? And, maybe what was your experience just sort of going through the protocol process? And I think, Yusuf, we'd love to hear your perspectives a little bit on how to talk about this type of work with the community. So I'll open it up to whomever would like to take that first when it comes to how was your experience with an ATI?
So Jessica, are the participants allowed to participate? Because there are actually 2 providers from Uganda who were critical, Professor Adi Kikitua.
Absolutely.
And
If they could raise their
if
hand,
they
I'd be
can
more
just
than happy.
unmute and
Yeah.
talk about that, because obviously, as I said, this study was done in sub-Saharan Africa. It was the care providers and teams on the ground, and I saw there was a very interesting question around the parents' reaction to that, and there's a very interesting conversation and dialogue around this. Not to put you on the spot, Professor Adi and Violet, but it would be great if either of you could answer that question around the ATI, because obviously we come up with how to monitor and what to follow, but the real face-to-face interaction, I would be making it up if I said I knew.
So I have Adi and Violet. I don't know if you want to, I'm going to also promote.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jessica, Deborah, and Gabriele. Yeah, so what has been the experience? Number one, right from the Institutional Review Board, it is a challenge for some of our sites here, one of our sites in Uganda. The IRB did not approve the study. They thought it was unethical. So that's a challenge. How do you get the IRBs to appreciate that science is what advances medicine, and that without science, we will never get a cure. Then working with the hospitals where we were recruiting from, you have to make sure that you sensitize the administrators, the people, the staff in the maternity, and actually recruit the participants right from antenatal. You know, as soon as you get a participant, a mother from antenatal, then you will be able to follow them through and alert and get the midwives in the maternity as soon as the mother comes in, or when the mother has the ability to call you, you are there to draw the blood. And of course, it even takes a toll to explain and counsel this mother, because on one side you are saying you must start and get this baby treated. On the other side, you are saying, you know, we need to do something to do research. So that balance is not easy. So you may get those who say, no, I'm not ready. You are not speaking the Ministry of Health language. And the fact that we don't have point of care in the maternities also took a bit of time for us, you know, within 24 hours, take the samples to another lab, and you are on top of the lab to make sure that they can give you results. But all in all, it is possible. And someone asked, what do the parents of these children say? We have just been the last 2 weeks explaining to them, you know, how their children who participated, the results were presented at CROI. And believe me, these mothers were, number one is they didn't want their names nor their children's identity let out. But beyond that, they said, we wish that other children would also have the opportunity to be off. In fact, one of our participants, you know, because now she is so confident that her child is off drugs, she can take that child to boarding school, you know, because on ARVs, when the children are so small, nobody wants to take them out of the home to be in the boarding school. So it opens a completely new window for these children and the families. But it's a challenge at programmatic level. How would you ever roll this out? That's the question, but there is always a beginning. Over to you, Jessica. And maybe
Great.
Dr.
Thank
Violet
you
can
so
pitch in.
much. That is a fantastic answer, and we're so happy that you were able to be on the line. And maybe before we go into more scientific questions, I'd love to hear from you, of your perspective, just how do we translate this to the community as well?
Okay, I think thank you so much, Jessica. I think Adeodata was really, really helpful here. Basically for our communities here, ATIs are just is analytical treatment interruptions, which is used in HIV trials to see whether an investigative trial or strategy can delay or prevent viral rebound after participants stop ARV. So basically at the community level, not only at PAVE, but actually as also the representative of PAVE at the Community Advisory Board cross-cap, where every collaboratory comes to present. We actually have been pushing for every CAP or for everyone doing some ATIs, understand the experiences of participants, be it language. And I think the first thing we actually started was actually to even see what are the really language that can be used. How can they understand what it is? Because sometimes even scientific jargons are being used that maybe to understand end up confusing communities. So at last, the community doesn't benefit from the ATI trials, and also we have issues around even research strategies. So also we are making input on the design. So trying to make sure that communities are part of every processes, right from the design, to make sure that this community understand what it is. How do you co-create with communities? How do you even manage their expectations? Maybe example, what really we saw from Fresh Trial in South Africa is actually that providing a little psychosocial support or even social behavioral changes can really, really change or move the needles. So how do you even manage their risks? How do you even provide support? How do you even do careful monitoring? Most of this side, clinical trial side, are really, really far from communities. What reimbursement do you provide that doesn't even have ethical considerations? How do you even make sure that you co-create those social behavioral study with them? How do you empower them to actually have that power to even decide for themselves? How do you even make sure that even their tutors, their parent, their guardians are really carried along in those processes? So those are those things we are doing to make sure that communities are at the forefront. Disruptive opportunities, especially innovation from the demand side, which are really, really those psychosocial support are really being provided in making sure that we have a balance of the scientific side having a success and also the community side having a success. It's actually a win-win thing. So that's really what we are really pushing. Even while you tell someone to actually stop ARVs, to actually test to see those strategies are working, we really need to balance those risk side to make sure that every community is carried along in the process. So I think those are key things we're doing, and it's really, really a lot to learn. The like of fresh trials, the like of what Adeodata have said, actually present a framework for us to actually learn. And there's a lot to learn, which I feel the scientific community really, really need to look around what is the need of the community. Carry us along, carry us from design to the implementation to even how scalable those things are. And I make sure, and I am very sure that a HIV cure strategy is really inside of us. So I think that's really what we need to imbibe. That really a balance between the scientific and the community will really, really give us a win-win approach. And thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think you just highlighted a really, important need to have the community up front and center to really help co-create, especially when it comes to the pediatric world, where it's not just the participant, but their caretaker as well, who is going to be part of the decision-making process and part of this as well. So maybe just a few additional scientific questions, kind of getting back into that. There was a nice question that came in. Number one is, could we have a situation where cell growth in children is so fast that their HIV integration and replication leads to control? And I guess this is probably for Dr. Cromhout, just thinking about, I think the fitness virus, again, trying to frame this question a bit, is when we think about the different types of fitness, is there something that perhaps it grows so fast that it burns itself out? Or could there be a special kind of virus that when it meets the immune system, it doesn't replicate as fast or rapidly?
Okay, so great question. And obviously this is an evolving field, as I mentioned before. And I'm just going to bring us back again. So those children who were able, our 5 males who were able to control without combination ART, they had this type 1 interferon sensitive virus that was low viral replicative capacity. So what that meant was that the type 1 interferon that these children were producing was then able to control the virus because it wasn't replicating so fast that it was able to escape the immune system. And so I think that's the important takeaway from this. And yeah, so in terms of cell growth and all of that, there's still a lot that we are learning with regards to NK cells and CTL responses, and that work is currently like going on, and we'd love to be able to answer more of that, at future meetings. But the idea is that we have this virus that's sensitive to what your immune system inherently has and uses, and that it then can't escape what that thing is, which in this case we're talking about type 1 interferon.
Great. And Dr. Persaud, there's a question that came in about what are the characteristics of the HIV reservoir of the Mississippi child after the rebound compared to the other children that you just presented in P115, and especially, I guess, after their rebound? Is there anything we've learned from that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because when we presented the case of the Mississippi child, her viral load was actually on the lower side, was less than 20,000. I think it was about 16,000 copies per mil, which led the field to sort of invoke what Dr. Cromhout was talking about in terms of a poorly replicating virus. So what we found when she rebounded, which is very classic for most people, is you actually rebound to where you started, no matter how many years of treatment you've received. And so her rebound level was very similar to what it was when she was diagnosed as acquiring HIV infection. So what we learned from these cases that we have is that, as you could see, the upswing in the viral load, because we were following them very carefully and closely, was pretty fast, which shows that there was some, it suggests there was some reservoir cell that still has that initial infecting virus replication capacity. But that's still that virus stayed in an integrated and quiet state during the ATI period. So, we're still in the phase of few cases here where, we're hopeful about it, and there's a lot to learn in terms of the virus, the replication capacity, and these reservoirs. But I think the main take-home message is that a simple, relatively simple, very early treatment strategy in a newborn, we were able to accomplish this in 4 children, 4 of 54 children. And from the cases from South Africa, those were 5 males. So, there are about 9 kids out there now who've had this outcome from very early treatment, which makes us very hopeful.
So I think building on that is, what can we infer as Gabriele's cohort had all males, and the P115 had predominantly females that ended up controlling. Is there something that we've learned about sex differences between the 2 groups?
So I think, so what we learned from P1115 is that girls were actually we had 2 arms, and you heard Professor Adi talked about following women antenatally, and those were women who may have known their status but were not fully suppressed during the pregnancy. That was sort of a convenience cohort, but we had a cohort 1, which were really women who didn't know that they were living with HIV infection. And so what we found in that cohort, that there were more girls who were born with infection, who acquired the infection, than boys. And then the girls were more likely to fail or not be suppressed on therapy. So I think it points to an emerging theme, a clear emerging theme in infection in newborns. And I see someone's asking about in utero infection, and what is that? And so these are babies who acquired the infection while being in utero. And so we're learning, I think there's an emerging theme here, at least in perinatal infection, that there are sex differences that we need to understand more. And it may be the interferon story that needs to be studied in other settings with other HIV subtypes.
Great. And maybe Dr. Cromhout, can you talk a little bit about the potential for control among children that you've seen?
Okay, so I think it's quite that's an interesting question, and I think that kind of comes all the way back around to our early infant diagnosis and starting on treatment, right? Because we don't have a marker, we don't have anything that tells us, okay, this child is going to be able to control. But what we can do is diagnose our moms and get them on therapy, and have early infant diagnosis and get children on therapy as fast as possible. And that leads to a smaller reservoir, which then improves morbidity and mortality, so the overall well-being and kind of length of life of these children, but then also improves their ability to potentially be cure candidates or post-treatment controllers in the future. And so I think the big thing to take home from what we are talking about today is these are unique children. They are not every child, and every child in our community needs to, if they acquire HIV, they need to be diagnosed as soon as possible and started on treatment, and as best as possible maintain that adherence so that they can have a fuller, healthier life and have more potential for cure going forward.
Great. And I think there's just a number of questions that have come in around ATI. And maybe the first one just being, I think, around the safety of what happens when somebody is on an ATI and the potential for drug resistance. And so this I know is not common, but maybe either of you could talk about what is the potential for drug resistance when in a clinical research under heavy monitoring, so, a child does have an ATI.
I mean, I can start. I think, there's obviously a risk of drug resistance, but what, from our experience, and this was with protease inhibitor based regimen, the children resuppressed very quickly on their original regimen within 2 months, with the same regimen, which suggests that they didn't really develop resistance at a level sufficient to prevent them from getting resuppressed again. We did have one child who had problems with adherence with the regimen once restarting, but upon switching to a dolutegravir-based regimen instead of a lopinavir-ritonavir-based regimen, became suppressed. Obviously, we will be doing testing on those samples to really define the outcome of resistance, because we need to understand that outcome.
Just to add on to that, I mean, my answer is largely similar in that sense. But I think that we need to remember that is obviously a worry, and that's why this very strict monitoring is in place. And so that, I mean, I think we know that many people, one of the big issues with living with HIV is having to take treatment every day. And with some of these regimens, like the protease inhibitors, you're taking twice a day, and it's an incredibly foul-tasting medication that these children have to take. And so it's very often that these children might miss a dose or get a half dose because maybe they spit it out and the parent doesn't see. So we are seeing, obviously, that these children over the course of their lifetime, or at least their childhood, they have stopped or haven't taken a dose or 2 doses, and they haven't ended up with resistance. That's not to say it can't happen and won't happen. Obviously, as beautifully as adherent as one can be is the goal, but that's the reason for this very strict monitoring in these ATIs, to make sure that as soon as you have any kind of viral blip or spike or anything, that child goes back on therapy and you don't end up with all the horrible effects of having a very high viral load, and then the viral resistance as well.
Yeah, and I think there was just another question that came in just around, in addition to the constant monitoring, are there other considerations? And I think this really raises what Yusuf was saying earlier around the need for social behavioral science and also community input to determine what are the messaging, what are the strategies that can go into when you have an ATI, that it's not just the monitoring, it's also the messaging and what participants and their family members can do to support them. So maybe not a question, but I think just how it would be great to hear how others can think about this work as far as creating and that support system for others.
Can I make a comment to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jessica, I think there's a lot in the chat in
Yes.
terms of the community and the community and the response to this and what needs to be done. And we could really learn from these ideas. If there's some way to capture what's in the chat, and maybe we can actually try to address it as a group. We need to have this conversation to understand what is given this information, what is the community's perspective on this, even the questions around drug resistance and, rebound and replication and reservoirs, I think, so that we can actually formulate concrete answers
Yeah.
rather than hand waving, so we can have real numbers around this. I think this, we're trying to figure out how to build the behavior, social behavioral aspect of this and community aspect of it. And all of these questions here are really critical so that we can do and Q&A and provide responses to you for the community, and then for them to feed back to us what we didn't say correctly so that we can correct ourselves, and how do we learn from each other to move together, because this really is going to be a journey, because I don't think we expected, as I said, what we expected an N of 1, we have 4. And if you count the Mississippi baby, that's 5. And if you count Gabriele's cohort, that's 5. That's a lot when you think of the adult space. And except for stem cell transplantation, we haven't really seen a lot in the adult space. And so it really tells us that we need to talk more as a group to figure out how to inform everyone about what we're doing, why we're doing it. I think Dr. Addy said it really beautifully, that science advances medicine, and this is about advancing the science of medicine and how we treat our patients so that they can go to boarding school.
Absolutely. And and I think what's also unique about this population is, everybody gets older every day, but when a child gets older, they really change in ways that we can't, that are big shifts and leaps and bounds, whether it be hormonal, biological changes, but also the social changes that a child goes through, whether it be ready to go to boarding school or ready to potentially date. And so how do we talk about all the phases of a pediatric life and address them when it comes to cure research? And so these are critical conversations, and why it's so important that we have, the community advisory board and advocates really engaged in this work. And maybe just as a last question, I think, just to build off what you were saying, Dr. Persaud, is just this idea of what can advocates take forward? What is the message? And so a question I'm going to ask is, at CROI, what is the community advocate question you wish somebody had asked you about the presentation so that you could give that message home?
Actually, I was asked a question.
Yeah.
And the question that I think is really important for the community, because I think the community is actually going to impact this. And really, how do we make this strategy not for remission necessarily, but for identification of acquiring infection and starting on treatment? And how do we identify children who are living with HIV, no matter, across the age spectrum, and starting them on treatment? And I think this falls on PEPFAR programs and other, and in-country programs on figuring out ways to make identification of infection and treatment of children a priority. And we need community voices to do this. And I think, if we're going to achieve remission and cure, it's probably going to happen in more children than in adults. And so we need to keep forging forward. And so the PEPFAR representative did ask me that question. And so I did say it's on PEPFAR to figure out help us figure out how we can work with them to move this forward.
Wonderful. And that's a great advocacy message, I think, for the community and those on the line to take forward as well. So Dr. Cromhout, what would be your question? What did you wish somebody had asked you for the advocacy community message to take forward?
So I was also asked, as an aside at my presentation, what has happened to our 5 children, because we reported them, and well, where are they? What's happening? And how has that process been in terms of the families and how they've been counseled in terms of the process? And so just to explain what's happened to some of those children. So what we have done is we have enrolled in an ATI study as well. However, it's slightly different from Dr. Persaud's one, where these children, we have to have proof that the children were aviremic without therapy. And so it would in fact be unethical to not start an ATI, because we need to figure out what was going on. And I think as much as I'd love to talk some more about that study, it is ongoing. But what's so exciting is that we have 4 children who are past the 6-month mark, who have remained aviremic off of therapy. And I think that that's a story of hope and something to look forward to in terms of what we can achieve in future. And just relating to how we speak to the families, as I think it was Yusuf and I think Dr. Addy also mentioned, it's really difficult to do messaging in these kinds of trials because everyone is told you take your medication no matter what. That is life. And now suddenly we're saying, oh, guess what? We're going to stop and we're going to watch. And that's a really frightening thing. And there are a lot of feelings around that from family members, from grandparents, great grandparents, all the way to neighbors. And I think that making sure that the study teams as well as the community can be supportive in these unique situations is really important. And allowing, there's always the chance of a rebound in these kinds of trials, and adequately preparing both the child and the family regarding, what that means and what will happen, so that when it comes to if that does happen, then they're not as shocked by what processes have to happen, because it's obviously something that can potentially happen. But I think, as we've said, early infant diagnosis, and if all the advocates can push for within their countries and communities early diagnosis and starting of treatment, that would be amazing in terms of making more children eligible for these kinds of cure interventions and potentially being post-treatment controllers. And I think that's really, really important. And also the use of dolutegravir. I know there are some countries that are still battling to get it. Here in South Africa, we intermittently get it, especially for the little ones. But what a big difference that makes in terms of adherence in these children. Because for those of you who have tasted Kaletra, as I mentioned, it is a foul drug to taste, and I would not want to be taking that twice a day. And the dolutegravir that we have now is dispersible and is really great. So advocating for that in your communities with your departments of health and organizations and PEPFAR, etc., is really, really important, so that we can move this work forward, both in prevention, treatment, and cure of HIV. So thank you to everyone for all the hard work that you're doing in this field.
I mean, both fantastic messages around building the infrastructure, I think, of treatment and how that really will impact cure. And I also think I really loved the note about messaging, that I think within the U=U space, how do we really translate what this is and what's going on? Yusuf, I'm going to give you the last word. Any final thoughts on what is the big takeaway for advocates? What should we be excited about?
I think there have never been exciting time for advocates like today. I think so many takeaways. We need to follow the science as every day. We need to give Deborah and also Jessica every time is that we need to meaningfully engage. We need to work as we need to meaningfully we need to be meaningfully engaged. We need to act as co-travelers because we really, really need each other. So we need to listen, we need to be heard, we need to be engaged rightly, not tokenism, and we need to be at the front seat as co-drivers. So we need to do that. Just like Dr. Deborah has just highlighted that early diagnosis and other things that need to be done. And I think even in the PEPFAR new strategy, you could see that PMTCT is actually at the forefront. There was actually some coalition even at the age 2022 that actually pediatric HIV prevention, testing, and treatment is actually at the forefront. So a lot of investment have been made, especially domestic mobilization of resources, which I felt those are things the researchers, the scientists need to really help us. We have really been doing things for the past 40 years, which have not really worked. So sometimes we really need those technical assistance from the scientists. What have they seen in real to help us really solve those things. I think for the last word is actually to say that we're always open, we are always ready, and we're really ready, and we're always open to actually help, to advocate to communities, to actually push gatekeepers to also listen to you, not only us. So thank you so much, and it's really an honor for community to be represented on this panel. I really doesn't take that for granted. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great, and thank you so much to both of our speakers and our larger panel, Yusuf, for joining in. I think this was a great first discussion and translation of what happened at CROI, and we really look forward to continue to your questions. So we will gather the information from the chat and make sure we make a plan to move forward. But thank you everybody so much, and thank you to our experts for your time and just sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Thank you, Jessica and Yusuf.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye.